Western Spring Television. Ours it is.
Good evening and welcome to Spring Global on Western Spring Television. Now the headlines. Leaders of South Africa's governing party meet to discuss President Ramaphosa's future amidst corruption scandal. Several people have been killed in explosions at two Russian military airfields. Sudan's military and civilian leaders sign initial deal aimed at restoring democratic transition. My name is Tunde Idowu. A handful of protesters in support of and against President Cyril Ramaphosa have gathered outside the venue where the governing ANC party's highest decision-making body is meeting to plot a way forward following a damning report against the president. The report released last week concluded that Mr. Ramaphosa may have a case to answer after he was accused of covering up the theft of millions of dollars from his private game farm in 2020. The president has denied any wrongdoings and has not been charged with any crime. His lawyers have said they will petition the Constitutional Court to challenge certain aspects of the report. Meanwhile, Parliament is expected to vote today on whether the president should be subjected to an impeachment inquiry. Opposition parties have said Mr. Ramaphosa can no longer be trusted and have called for early election.
So we are here that we are not saying anyone as a member of the African National Conference is above the law or is above the constitution of the ANC.
My clarion call that Cyril Ramaphosa must go. He cannot be allowed to stay. He is putting the ANC into disrepute.
We had an NEC last week Friday which could not conclude on its business. There was a request that the fuller complement of the NEC should sit, including the president. The National Working Committee made a determination that looking at the issues that will be discussed and the request made by the president, that consistent with practice, it is only fair that we recuse the president. So once he has delivered this political overview, we then allowed the president to leave the work.
China's foreign ministry has defended its COVID measures, saying they have protected people's lives and the country continued to optimize and improve its policies according to the development of the epidemic situation. Businesses reopened and testing requirements were relaxed in Beijing and other Chinese cities today as the country tentatively eases out of a strict zero-COVID policy that sparked nationwide protests. In the capital, Beijing, where many businesses have fully reopened, commuters were no longer required to show a negative virus test taken within 48 hours to use public transport. Financial hub Shanghai, which underwent a brutal 2-month lockdown this year, was under the same rules, with residents able to enter outdoor venues such as parks and tourist attractions without a recent test. Meanwhile, shops have been shut in the Kurdish-populated city of Sanandaj in western Iran as protesters call for a 3-day strike. Unrest against the Islamic regime is approaching 4 months in Tehran after 22-year-old Masha Amini died in police custody. The strike steps up pressure on Iranian authorities after the Attorney General said this weekend that the morality police, whose detention of a young woman triggered months of protests, had been shut down. Similar calls for strike actions and mass mobilizations have in past weeks resulted in an escalation in the arrest. In the meantime, a London-based analyst who focuses on freedom of expression and access to information online in Iran has dismissed the claim that the Islamic Republic is disbanding its notorious morality police. Masha Alimadani, a senior researcher at the human rights organization Article 19, said articles within the Islamic Penal Code remain. He insisted that nothing is actually changing with regards to restrictive dress codes for women, which can still be enforced.
They are in fact not scrapped, the news was misreported, and even if the morality police are scrapped, this misinformation has worked in favor of the regime to distract folks, to distract the movement, to distract international solidarity from forming, policing the way women dress, policing the way people express themselves or protest. So there's a lot of fear. So there's a lot of momentum that needs to be there amongst the international community that this news can seriously distract from, to ensure that the demands of the protesters and those who have risked their lives,
In other news, several people have been killed in explosions at two Russian military airfields. Russian state media said a fuel tanker exploded, killing 3 people and injuring 6 others in an airfield near the Ryazan, southeast of Moscow. Another 2 people are reported to have been hurt in an explosion at an airfield in the Saratov region. It is not known what caused the blast, but both areas are hundreds of kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Long-range Russian strategic bombers are believed to be based at the Angels Air Base in the Saratov region. The Saratov regional governor said security forces were checking what he called reports of an incident at military installations. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov today hosted his Azerbaijani counterpart Jehun Braimov in Moscow in order to develop bilateral cooperation. The foreign ministers are also slated to discuss the Azerbaijan-Armenian normalization process. They were to also exchange opinions on the most pertinent aspects of the regional and international agenda. The United Nations has delayed a decision on who should represent Myanmar amidst concerns that Russia, which has become increasingly close to Myanmar's coup leaders, could sabotage efforts to reach an international consensus on the crisis-torn country. The UN's Credential Committee, composed of 9 UN member states, including China, Russia, and the United States, started meeting on November 29th under consideration of who should represent Myanmar in the body. The committee will submit its recommendations to the United Nations General Assembly, which usually rubber stamps the advice given. The UN is to choose one of the sitting UN ambassador, Kawi Motun, appointed by the elected government of leader Aung San Suu Kyi, or a nominee of the generals who staged the coup that overthrew her government in February 2021. In the Middle East, Palestinian authorities said a Palestinian man was killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank early today. The Palestinian news agency, quoting health officials, said the victim was 22-year-old Omar Mana and that 6 other Palestinians were also wounded. The shooting, which occurred near the city of Bethlehem, comes amidst a crackdown by Israeli forces in the territory, with near-daily raids in the occupied West Bank leading to killings and arrests. According to the agency, Israeli soldiers entered the refugee camp on the outskirts of Bethlehem in the morning, sparking clashes with a group of local residents, then firing tear gas and opening fire at the crowd. However, the Israeli military said soldiers entered the camp to arrest what it described as 3 wanted militants, adding that its soldiers opened fire after the crowd threw rocks and bombs at them. You're watching Spring Global on Western Spring Television. We'll be right back after this break.
Sports is a culture on its own. It has its own language, its own people, with their own way of life. The world of sports is never void of actions, stories, dramas, and scandals. I guess you need a sports show that can walk the walk and talk the talk.
On this show, we answer all your sporting questions. The whens, the whys, the wheres, and even the what-ifs. Sports Spring is that show that will give you that new lease of life you've been looking for in sport journalism. Join me, Joseph Atewe,
And your sports Amazon, Nengi Enes.
on this station, Western Spring Television, channel 190, only on Star Times.
Let's talk sports. Let's speak the most universal language of the world.
You're still watching Spring Global live from Western Spring Television. Turning to Sudan. Sudan's military and civilian leaders today signed an initial deal aimed at ending a deep crisis that has gripped the northeast African country since the coup a year ago. The deal allows for a 2-year civilian-led transition towards election. The deal, part of a 2-phase political process, was signed by Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the multiple civilian groups, notably the Forces for Freedom and Change, which was ousted in last year's coup. But protests challenging the agreement have already begun in the capital, Khartoum, and more are expected across the country as people call for those who led the coup to be held accountable. The past year has seen near-weekly protests and street clashes that have claimed 120 lives, a spiraling economic crisis, and a rise in ethnic violence in several remote regions. The deal was negotiated in the presence of officials from the United Nations, African Union, and Western diplomats. In the meantime, authorities in Sudan have released a prominent pro-democracy activist, Wagdi Salih, after nearly 2 months in jail. The move came ahead of the signing of an agreement between the military and the civilian coalition Mr. Salih belongs to. He is head of an anti-corruption committee in charge of dismantling the regime of toppled President Omar al-Bashir, who is currently on trial. Earlier, the former president, who was ousted in a popular uprising in 2019, was moved from prison to hospital to complete some medical treatment. West African leaders have told Mali's ruling junta to release 46 Ivorian troops taken prisoner in July or face sanctions. President of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Commission, Omar Aliou Touare, disclosed this to journalists at a summit in Nigeria. The Gambian diplomat also said the West African bloc reserved the right to act if the soldiers are not released by January 4th. The Ivorian troops were arrested on the 10th of July on the arrival at the airport in Mali's capital, Bamako. Ivory Coast says the troops were sent to provide backup for the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali, MINUSMA, and are being unfairly detained. But Mali says the troops are mercenaries and has placed them in custody on charges of attempting to harm state security.
Leaders have also expressed concern over the continued detention of 46 Ivorian soldiers in Mali, and call on Malian authorities to release the soldiers latest 1st of January 2023. We'll continue to dialogue with the authorities in Mali for the immediate release of the 46 soldiers detained in Mali. In the event the soldiers are not released quickly, the leaders reserve the right, and they have taken the decision to take certain measures.
Elsewhere, the largest trial in Belgian history kicked off today with 10 men accused of involvement in Islamist suicide bombings in Brussels in 2016 that killed 32 people and injured over 300. Set to last 7 months, the trial revived painful memories for those who lost loved ones, were injured, or witnessed the twin bombings at the airport and a third bomb on the metro on March 22nd, 2016. Around 1,000 people have registered to be represented in the hearing. The 10 defendants face charges including murder, attempted murder, and membership or participation in the acts of a terrorist group. If convicted, some of them could face up to 30 years in prison. Turning to South America, a landslide on a road in the province of Risaralda in western Colombia has killed at least 3 people and buried dozens more. A bus full of passengers was among several vehicles buried under mud and rocks, which tumbled down a hillside following heavy rain. One of the passengers helped his wife and 2 children escape from the bus before he was buried and died. Rescuers are using heavy machineries to try to dislodge the mud. The bus is thought to have had 2 drivers and 25 passengers on board. Colombian President Gustavo Petro wrote on Twitter that 9 people had been rescued and more than 20 were still missing. 3 Chinese astronauts have returned to Earth after completing a 6-month mission aboard China's space station. They left for space on the 5th of June to oversee the final construction stage of the Tiangong space station, which was completed in November. The crew touched down on board the Shenzhou 14 spacecraft in China's autonomous region of Inner Mongolia. China's space agency declared the mission a complete success. Crude oil prices have risen after major producers agreed to continue to cut output, and the G7 and its allies agreed to cap the price of Russian oil. Brent crude rose by about 0.6% to above $86 a barrel today. On Friday, the G7 agreed to cap the price of Russian oil at $60 a barrel to raise pressure on Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, oil producers group OPEC Plus said at the weekend that it will stick to its policy of reducing output. OPEC Plus is a group of 23 oil exporting countries, including Russia, which meets regularly to decide how much crude oil to sell on the world markets. In the meantime, India says it will prioritize its energy needs and continue to buy oil from Russia as a G7 enforced price cap comes into effect. India's Minister of External Affairs disclosed this during his visit to his German counterpart, where they discussed bilateral relations and Russia's war in Ukraine. He said it was not right for European countries to prioritize their energy needs, but asked India to do something else. India's Minister of External Affairs did not directly refer to the price cap, but said the European Union was importing more fossil fuel from Russia than India. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India has steadily increased its purchases of discounted Russian oil. Into some sports stories, Senegal coach Aliou Cissé has identified defensive mistakes and a gulf in class as the main reasons behind their 3-0 defeat by England in the last 16 at the World Cup in Qatar. The Teranga Lions, who were without injured striker Sadio Mane and suspended midfielder Idrissa Gana Gueye, made a positive start, and the African champions were the better side until England scored twice just before half-time. England scored a third goal early in the second half, which effectively ended the contest and ensured a quarter-final meeting with France for Gareth Southgate's side. According to Cisse, Senegal's strength before the World Cup was their defensive setup, noting that the fact they have let in a lot of goals at the tournament is difficult to explain. Senegal failed to qualify for the knockout stages in Russia 4 years ago, and Cisse, whose side were ranked 18th in the world, thinks his team are on an upward trajectory. Meanwhile, with Morocco also making it through to the last 16, the 46-year-old sees African football making progress despite his side's exit. Raheem Sterling has left the England World Cup squad in Qatar and returned to London after his home was burgled. The Chelsea winger missed Sunday's 3-0 last 16 win over Senegal. Police said no one was home at the time of the burglary on Saturday evening, in which jewelry and watches were taken and no threats of violence were involved. The player's spokesperson said Sterling is prioritizing the well-being of his 3 young children. Before we end Spring Global, here is a recap of our top stories. A handful of protesters in support of and against President Cyril Ramaphosa have gathered outside the venue where the governing ANC party highest decision-making body is meeting to plot a way forward following a damning report against the president. Several people have been killed in explosions at 2 Russian military airfields. Sudan's military and civilian leaders today signed an initial deal aimed at ending a deep crisis that has gripped the Northeast African country since a coup a year ago. Don't forget to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Western Spring Television. You can also watch us live on our YouTube channel at Western Spring Television. I am Tunde Ido.